Think about the last time someone said nothing and you felt it more than any words. A parent who didn't answer. A room that went quiet at exactly the wrong moment. Silence isn't neutral. It has texture, weight, temperature. It means different things depending on who's doing it and why. Most people feel silence because they're afraid of it. They talk to cover uncertainty, to seem confident, to take up space before someone else does. In football, a sport built on noise, on shouting, on constant communication, this is even more pronounced. Players call for the ball. Coaches shout instructions. Benches erupt every time something goes wrong or right. And then there was Zinedine Zidane, standing in the middle of all of it, saying almost nothing. Not because he was shy, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had figured out something about silence that most people spend their whole lives missing. That in a noisy room, the person who stays quiet often ends up holding the most attention. This is the story of how a man who rarely raised his voice became the one everyone listened to most. When Zidane made his professional debut at AS Cannes in 1989, he was 17. The youngest player on a squad of experienced men who had their own routines, their own hierarchies, their own ways of doing things. The normal move for a young player in that situation is to assert yourself, to be loud in training, to make your presence known, to demonstrate that you belong. Zidane did the opposite. For his first months as a professional, he observed more than he spoke. He watched how the veterans carried themselves, how they managed pressure, what they did before matches and after them. He let his play make the argument rather than his words. And in the gaps he left, people started to pay attention in a different way, waiting to see what he would do rather than filtering out another voice in the noise. His first coach at Cannes, Jean Varod, noticed it early. He later said that the quiet ones were the dangerous ones, that Zidane never announced what he was going to do. He just did it. By the time you understood he was special, he had already taken control of the match. It wasn't a strategy. Not yet. It was just who he was. But it was already working. As his career grew, the pressure to speak grew with it. Football at the highest level runs partly on media. Interviews, press conferences, the constant generation of quotes and opinions and reactions. Most players learn to perform this, to produce words that satisfy the demand without saying anything that could become a problem. It becomes its own skill, almost disconnected from the actual game. Zidane never quite learned it, or never quite wanted to. His post-match interviews were brief in a way that stood out. 90 seconds where other players gave 10 minutes. 30 words where others gave 300. He answered questions without expanding them, acknowledged performances without analyzing them, and declined to speculate about anything he didn't know for certain. Journalists found him genuinely difficult to interview, not because he was hostile, but because he gave them so little to work with while somehow leaving a strong impression. One French journalist described it as trying to photograph smoke. You got just enough substance to create something, but never enough to feel like you'd captured anything. The mystery stayed intact. What this meant, practically, was that Zidane rarely said anything that could be used against him. While other players created storylines through their words, rivalries, complaints, promises, he stayed mostly outside the noise. His football spoke, and his silence protected the space around it. On the pitch, the silence had a different quality. Football is a game of constant verbal communication. Players calling for passes, organizing defense, signaling runs. You can hear it if you're ever close enough. A continuous layer of sound underneath the crowd noise. The game talking to itself. Zidane operated differently. He communicated mainly through eye contact and body orientation. Where he was facing, the angle of his shoulders, a look held for a fraction of a second before a pass. His teammates at Juventus, at Real Madrid, on the French national team all describe learning to read this language. It took time. But once you had it, it felt more precise than words. Words can be imprecise, can arrive too late, can mean different things in the noise of a match. A look is immediate. For opponents, this was genuinely disorienting. Most players telegraph their intentions through what they say and how they react. Excitement when something is working. Frustration when it isn't. Verbal tells before certain moves. Zidane gave almost none of this away. Former Liverpool defender Jamie Carragher said playing against him was like playing against a ghost. You never knew what was coming until it had already happened, because he revealed nothing until the moment itself. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was information control. And in a game where reading your opponent is half the battle, giving nothing away is its own form of power. The 1998 World Cup final against Brazil is remembered for the goals. 2 headers from Zidane, a third from Petit, a 3-0 result that France had barely allowed itself to imagine. But there is a detail from before the match that his teammates have returned to in interviews over the years that says something about how he occupied a room. In the dressing room at the Stade de France, with 80,000 people outside and 30 million watching on television across the country, Zidane spoke briefly to his teammates. Not a long speech, not a tactical summary, just a few sentences about trusting themselves, trusting each other, trusting that they were ready. Then he stopped. Lilian Thuram, who was not an easily impressed person and had played in major matches his entire career, later described the 2 minutes of silence that followed. He said it wasn't uncomfortable. Silence wasn't the silence of people not knowing what to say. It was something more like the silence of people who had understood something at the same time. A shared readiness that didn't need words to confirm itself. What Zidane had done was leave space. Hadn't filled the room so completely that there was nothing left for his teammates to feel. He had said what needed to be said and then gotten out of the way of it. When he arrived at Real Madrid in 2001 as the most expensive player in the world, the expectation was enormous. Not just for his football, but for his personality. The Galactico project was about spectacle in every dimension. Great players who were also great presences, who gave the media what it needed, who filled the space around the club with magnetism. Zidane's response, characteristically, was to become quieter. The more attention focused on him, the less he offered publicly. A single nod in the dressing room carried more information than a speech from someone else. His teammates learned quickly that his silence wasn't absence. It was his way of being present at full intensity without performing it. Roberto Carlos said later that you didn't need Zidane to tell you what to do. His presence on the pitch was clear enough that you automatically knew where to be, when to move, how to play. He led through being rather than through talking. It sounds like mysticism until you've experienced it. That particular quality some people have of making the room organize itself around them without saying a word. The 2002 Champions League final volley. The goal everyone remembers. The one that still appears on lists of the greatest moments in football. Came out of 17 seconds of complete stillness. While 90,000 people screamed, Zidane entered a private quiet and hit the ball with a precision that seemed to belong to a different category of human capability. The silence came first. The goal came from it. When he became a coach, people wondered how someone so quiet would manage the constant communication that coaching requires. The team talks, the tactical instructions, the management of egos and pressures and crises. The assumption was that coaching meant talking, and Zidane had never been much of a talker. What happened instead was that he brought the same approach to managing people that he had always brought to playing among them. His training sessions were quieter than most. Fewer instructions shouted across the pitch, more space for players to work things out, more observation than direction. He positioned himself where players could see him, communicated through gestures and expression, and allowed long periods of play without interruption. Karim Benzema said that Coach Zidane taught them to listen, not just to him, but to the game itself. When you're not being constantly told what to do, you develop your own reading of situations. The silence made them more self-sufficient, more decisive, more capable of handling moments in matches when there was no time to look to the sideline for guidance. His pre-match talks became known among his players for their brevity. Before the 2017 Champions League final against Juventus, his instructions were essentially, "Play your football. You know what that means." The players did know, because the months of preparation had already communicated everything that needed to be communicated. The talk was just the last quiet before the beginning. In May 21-18, having won 3 consecutive Champions League titles, something no manager had done in the modern era, Zidane called a press conference and resigned. The speech lasted 93 seconds. There was no criticism of the club, no detailed explanation of his reasons, no suggestion of where he was going next. He said he believed it was the right moment for everyone, that the team needed a different voice after 3 years, and that was essentially it. The football world spent days trying to understand what had happened, looking for the real reason in the spaces between his words, analyzing the brief statement for subtext. Some found it. Most probably invented it. Zidane didn't clarify. The silence after the speech was as complete as the speech itself had been. There is something worth sitting with in that exit. He had won everything there was to win in that job. He left at a moment of total success rather than waiting for things to turn. And he left without creating a noise that would follow him. No public grievances, no score settling, nothing that could become a story someone else could control. He walked out of the room and left it quiet. In a sport that runs on noise, on controversy and opinion and the constant generation of content, the most consistent thing about Zidane across 30 years was that he understood silence differently than almost everyone around him. Not as absence, not as withdrawal, as a choice about where to put your weight and when and how much.